Okay, more about air springs. I'm using air springs because I want to adjust the spring rate. Because I'm going to have heavy loads in the back of my truck and a snowplow on or off the front of my truck, and I just like the idea of being able to adjust the spring rate rather than have heavy springs there all the time. I also want to be able to adjust my ride height because I need a tall truck when I'm off-roading, and I want the truck to be able to come down relatively low as feasible for highway driving, just for safety. Now, to do that, airbags are an ideal solution because I can adjust the height of the vehicle and I can adjust its resistance to compression by the pressure that I put in the airbags. Well, that's pretty straightforward, but there's another thing I can adjust, which is in some ways the most important, and that's the spring rate, which isn't exactly the force of the spring, it's how the spring works dynamically over the length of its stroke. In other words, a spring that's very linear, you may have heard of the difference between linear and progressive springs. A linear spring, for every inch that you can compress it, let's say you move it an inch, you compress it an inch, it takes 100 pounds. The next inch takes another 100 pounds. The next inch takes another 100 pounds. So to compress the spring 3 inches is 300 pounds. So for every inch you have an equal proportion of force that's required to do it. It's a very, very linear spring. A progressive spring gets more and more difficult as you compress the spring. So the first inch might be 100 pounds. The next one would be 200 pounds. The next inch would be 300 pounds. So to compress the spring 3 inches takes 500 pounds now, giving you a much more progressive spring. Now, why you want a progressive spring versus a linear spring is debatable. Everyone seems to argue about that, but I think most people argue about it because they don't really even know what it means. So in my case, I want a very linear spring when I'm off-road. That way the truck can take a lot of suspension travel and take advantage of that full travel without driving the truck up into the air and losing traction. When I'm on road, I want a very progressive spring, especially because I'm going to be lowered and I won't have that much more travel. So I want the spring to get much, much stiffer as it gets to the end of its travel, so it doesn't bottom out. And so when I corner, it basically reacts like a car rather than a big, loppy, soft spring truck. Okay, now progressive versus linear. Stock Land Rovers came with leaf springs, which by nature are a relatively progressive spring. They're progressive because when you have a stack of leaves, as you straighten out the leaves, compressing the spring, more and more leaves come into play and more spring rate is added. So you get quite a progressive spring, which is really why Land Rovers are very, very good at heavy load carrying capacity and general all-around work truck. But they're not all that great in terms of lots of articulation and really soft springs for off-road. That's where the coil spring came in. When they added coil springs, especially coil springs that are wound with even coils, they're very linear spring. In fact, at every inch, you have just about the same rate. So coil spring Rovers tended to be much better at keeping their tires on the ground in off-road situations. Leaf-sprung Land Rovers tend to walk across a little bit more. Now that's okay. I have no problem with leaf-sprung Land Rovers. As you know, love leaf-sprung Land Rovers. However, that is the advantage of a coil. Now, I don't think the advantages of coils really outweigh the disadvantages of coils. Progressive versus linear springs. Why do we want it? I've explained. How do we get it? Now, in a leaf spring, you can go for a somewhat more linear spring by going to parabolics. That's basically one of the reasons parabolics give you better articulation and better off-road ride is because they're much more linear spring. They are mostly because they're less leaves and the leaves don't touch each other. So you get, you don't have stacked leaves. You tend to have full-length leaves, so their spring rate isn't really changing over the travel. It is somewhat because parabolic springs are thicker in the middle on a parabolic curve. Now, I wish I had the time and energy and resources to be able to do full load spring analysis of parabolic springs versus standard Land Rover springs, but I just don't. But anyway, parabolic springs give you a much more linear spring. I think that's also part of the reason they're susceptible to failure, certainly in overload situations. Coil springs, they're a lot easier to tune coil springs in terms of spring rate because a evenly wound coil, where all the coils are the same spacing, is quite a linear spring. To make them more progressive, what they'll do is they'll make the coils closer together at one end. And what happens then, as the spring compresses, those coils make contact. And suddenly you don't have 8 coils doing your suspension, you only have 4. And so for the same amount of travel, the springs that are remaining have to move twice as far, giving you a curve, therefore a much more progressive spring. I'm hoping I can show you some curves, maybe I already have. Pop-ups over my face or somewhere. Anyway, back to air springs. The neat thing about air springs is you can adjust your springing from a very linear spring to a very progressive spring while you're driving down the road. And it's really, really easy. How it's done is by adjusting the volume of the swept area. Basically, if you imagine a cylinder or an airbag, as it compresses from its fully extended position to its fully compressed position, you're going from a large volume of air to a very small volume of air. At that point, we're using Boyle's law, which is the magic of using airbags for dynamic springing. As the volume decreases, the pressure increases in a inverse proportionally. In other words, it creates a curve, a very, very progressive curve. In fact, it's very difficult to compress the last inch of a cylinder or an airbag. Now, what if that airbag was connected to a large air tank? So as I compress the airbag, most of the air is just going out a hose to a large air reservoir. So it's as if I'm only pushing the very end of the airbag in, and the total swept volume is much larger. Well, I get a much more linear spring. Almost every inch of travel is represented by an equal amount of force. I can show it to you because I created a little experiment for you here. You're probably wondering what this was. This is a pneumatic cylinder with a platform on it connected to a gauge, pressure gauge. It's also connected through this valve and this hose to a large air tank. We call them an air pig in Canada. I don't know if that's universal. There's another valve at this end that I can open or close so that I can use just the air in the cylinder plus the air in the blue hose, enlarging my swept area, or in fact all the air, also including the 5 gallons in this tank, which is kind of meaningless because you get an incredibly linear spring at that rate. So let's zero the whole setup, and if you can see, and I kind of doubt you can, but that pressure gauge goes up quite quickly as I press down on the cylinder, or as if you're hitting a bump with your Land Rover with your airbags. So for every inch, this starts to go up about twice as much as the previous inch. And it gets really quite hard to compress at the end. I'm up and around, well, I can just bounce it off 100 psi. So that's a very, very progressive spring because the swept volume is only what's in the cylinder. Let's add the blue hose into this circuit. So now there's the whole swept area of the cylinder plus about twice as much again in the blue hose. Well, now we have a much more linear spring. Much linear because I still have the valve open at the tank here. Okay. Now we have a much more linear spring. It's still a spring, and it's still getting slightly harder as I go down. If you see, the pressure gauge goes up to about 10 pounds per square inch. So now, again, that curve would be leveled out quite a bit. It would be almost a linear spring. Now if I add in to the circuit the big yellow tank here, I have a huge volume of air, and oh my gosh, I mean, it would never work like this as a spring. Your truck would just fall over. But the force is still the same, required for the first inch. So the truck would still sit as high, it would still handle the same way, but boy, it would be supple springs off-road. I mean, you could push that spring right up into the fender well with almost no force. It'd be great off-road. Maybe this would be just a bit too linear, but just for the sake of experimentation, I wanted to show you how that worked. So let's close it all up again and get some real data. Remember, Boyle's law is the law of gases relating pressure to volume, and they're inversely proportional. So most experiments with Boyle's law make equal changes in volume, and they graph the curve with increasing and increasing pressure. I'm going to do it the other way around. I'm actually going to increase equal steps of pressure, giving me a curve of the travel, the distance it's traveling, which is really the effect I want. So I'm going to start loading bricks up on this platform, and we'll start to see what kind of curve we get. I'll put one brick on at a time. That will be an equal step. I don't know what the bricks weigh. It doesn't really matter because as long as they all weigh the same amount, we can plot it on a curve. And I'm going to take down the distance it travels with this tape measure I put here. And with that, I'll be able to plot it on a curve. So let's get started. Okay, let's add bricks and record the total travel. One brick takes us to almost 4 inches. 2 bricks, 6.5 inches. 3 bricks, 8 inches. 4 bricks, 9 inches. 5 bricks, 9.5 inches. 6 bricks, 10 inches. Well, you can see with each successive brick, this platform moves down less and less and less, giving us a very progressive spring. Well, that's because I've got the valve closed and we're only using the air that's inside the cylinder. Now as an experiment, let's make the spring more linear by opening the valve and including the blue hose in the circuit as well. I'm just going to zero this. I leave about 1 pound of air in this air pig so that I can just make sure everything is kind of neutralized before we start. I'll tell you one thing, I can't stack bricks on here because after 2 bricks this thing will be bottomed out. So I'm going to stack it with something I seem to have an awful lot around here. It seems to be empties. Okay, there's another limitation to this particular part of the test, is that there are some inherent frictions in this cylinder. It's a good cylinder and I've put a fair amount of lubricant in it to try and improve it, but because of a certain degree of friction and the fact that I can't always load it perfectly square, some of the positioning is lost basically due to the friction. But I'm hoping you'll get the point. So 1 bottle is going to bring us down, I have to try and sort of get this to average out, let's say 2.5 inches. 2 bottles, I get this to average out a bit, I'm going to say 4 inches. 3 bottles, I'm going to say 5.5 inches. 4 bottles, I'm going to say 6.5 inches. 5 bottles, I'm going to say 7.5 inches. Well, you can see from these numbers, 2.5 to 4 and a bit to 5.5 to 6.5 to 7.5. It's almost a completely linear spring. I could add some more bottles. I'm sure I have some more. There we go. What are we at? 5? Let's say 6 bottles. 8.5. Imagine that. 7 bottles. 9.25. We're starting to see a little bit of progression in our spring. I'm not sure how well I'm loading this. 9.25. 10.25. 11. So we're just seeing a little bit of a curve. That's almost a very linear. It is beginning to be at a very linear spring. Again, I apologize because of the friction in here. We're not getting really good numbers here. But if I average those out, I think we'll find that we have a very linear spring here. Okay, Boyle's Law. Adjust the volume beyond your airbag to adjust your spring rate. That's a pretty neat way to tune the suspension on your truck. Pretty cool, eh? See you later.